Mae Sutton pressed both hands flat against her husband's grave marker and told him she was sorry. Not for grieving, not for surviving, for what she was about to do. The bank notice was stuffed in her apron pocket, and the men riding up her road weren't coming to offer kindness. She was 26 years old, a widow, overweight, and alone in the Wyoming Territory. And she had exactly one day to save everything James ever built. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. Let me know how far this tale has traveled. Notice had been nailed to the front door sometime before dawn. Clara Mae Sutton found it when she stepped out to draw water from the well, the morning air still cold enough to bite through her cotton dress. Her boots untied at the laces because she hadn't slept, and her fingers weren't working the way they should. Stood on the porch and read the paper twice, then a third time. Then she folded it very carefully, the way her mother had taught her to fold church bulletins, and tucked it into the front pocket of her apron. Then she went inside and made coffee, because that was the only thing she knew to do when the world ended. James would have made a joke. That was the first thing she thought, standing at the cast-iron stove with the coffee pot in her hand. He would have said something like, "Well, Clara, Mae, it looks like we're in a pickle," and then he would have laughed, that big, chest-filling laugh of his, and somehow the pickle would have seemed smaller. But James had been dead for 7 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, and no one was making jokes in the Sutton house anymore. The notice was from Harlan Briggs at the Territorial Bank of Millhaven. Nay, it stated, language that Clara Mae supposed was meant to sound official and final. At the Sutton Ranch, all 412 acres of it, including the grazing land along the creek, a barn, the main house, and the equipment therein, was to be repossessed by the bank within 30 days if the outstanding debt of $940 was not paid in full. $940. James had borrowed against the land 2 years before his death. He'd needed a new bull, a repaired roof on the hay barn, and seed for the south field. He'd been certain, absolutely certain, in the way that James was certain about most things, that the harvest would cover it, that they'd be clear of the debt before winter. But then the summer had been too dry. And then the early frost had killed most of the south field crop. And then James had gotten sick in October, a cough that turned into something deeper, something that settled in his chest and wouldn't leave. And then there was no more James. Clara Mae had kept making payments. Small ones, what she could manage. She'd sold 2 horses. She'd taken in mending work from 3 families in town. She'd gone without new boots through the worst of winter, wrapping her feet in wool socks and old cloth to keep the cold out. It hadn't been enough. She was standing at the window with her coffee when she saw the riders. Coming up the road from town at an unhurried pace, the kind of pace that said they weren't worried about what they'd find when they arrived. Harlan Briggs was in the center, riding a bay horse that was too fine for the rest of him. He was a short, compact man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and small eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. On his left rode Deputy Aldous Crane, who wasn't really there in any official capacity, but who liked to be wherever there was something interesting happening. On his right was a younger man Clara Mae didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, city-dressed, with the look of someone who wrote things down on paper for a living. She set down her coffee cup. She retied her bootlaces. He walked outside. "Mr. Briggs," she said, standing at the top of her porch steps with her hands folded in front of her. "I received your notice." Harlan Briggs pulled up his horse and looked down at her, with the expression of a man who was already thinking about what came after this conversation. "Miss Sutton," he said, "Widow Sutton, we've come to discuss the matter of the debt. I'm aware of what you've come about. Then you know there's not much to discuss." He reached into his coat and pulled out papers of his own, thicker than the bank notice. 30 days, as stated, unless you've got the full sum ready, which, he glanced at her house, at her dress, but at her. In general, which I suspect you don't. Deputy Crane snorted. He didn't bother hiding it. "I don't have the full sum today," Clara Mae said. But I intend to. Widow Sutton Briggs spoke over her the way men in Millhaven had always spoken over her, as if her sentences were merely the beginning of their own. I've heard about your intentions before. Intentions don't pay notes. He shifted in his saddle. Now, I've spoken with Thomas Aldgate, and he's prepared to make an offer on the property. A fair one given the circumstances. Thomas Aldgate was the largest landowner in Millhaven County. He was also the man who had tried to buy the Sutton land from James twice, and twice James had refused. He was also the man who had sat in the front pew at James's funeral, and shaken Clara Mae's hand and said, "If there's anything you need, you just ask." Understood now what he'd meant by anything. "I'm not interested in selling," Clara Mae said. Briggs looked at her, the way a person looks at a child, who has said something charming but incorrect. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand your position." "I understand it completely, Mr. Briggs." "Then you understand that a woman in your—" He paused. His eyes moved over her the way they always did. Most eyes in Millhaven moved over her, noting her size, her shape, the fact that she did not fit the particular mold that women in Wyoming Territory were apparently required to fill. 18 is in your situation. Alone out here, no husband. No family nearby. "I have 2 ranch hands. Boys of 16, Crane said from behind Briggs. Barely. They're capable workers. Clara Mae said, keeping her voice level the way she'd practiced. Keeping it level for 7 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. "Capable doesn't matter if the bank calls the note," Briggs said. "And the bank is calling the note. 30 days, Widow Sutton. Think carefully about Mr. Aldgate's offer. It's more generous than you deserve, given the state of things." He turned his horse. The 2 men with him turned as well. Then Crane, because Crane had never been able to leave well enough alone, glanced back over his shoulder. "You know," he said, almost cheerfully, "James was a smart man. It's a shame he didn't marry smarter." Clara Mae didn't move. She stood at the top of her porch steps and watched them ride away, and she kept her face very still and her hands very quiet at her sides, and she did not give Aldous Crane the satisfaction of seeing what his words did to the inside of her chest. She waited until the riders were small shapes on the road to town. Then she sat down on the top step of her porch and put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She had stopped crying somewhere around the 3rd month, when she'd realized that crying didn't fix fences or feed cattle or make the numbers in her ledger add up differently. She just sat there with her face in her hands and breathed, and let herself feel the full weight of the situation for exactly 60 seconds, because 60 seconds was all she could afford. When she lifted her head, there was a stranger standing at her gate. She hadn't heard him arrive. The horse, a tall, dark gray animal with a calm eye and good legs, was tied to the fence post, and the man himself was standing just outside the gate with his hat in his hands, which meant he'd taken it off. Which meant he'd been standing there long enough to decide it was the right thing to do. He was tall, that was the first thing. Tall and built the way men got built when they spent their lives doing actual work rather than talking about it. His hair was dark brown with early threads of gray at the temples, and his face was the kind of face that had spent a long time in the sun and the wind, not old exactly, but settled. Experienced. The kind of face that had seen enough that it didn't feel the need to perform anything. His eyes were brown, dark brown, and they were looking at her with something she hadn't seen in a long time. "Not pity, just attention, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and even. "My name is Eli Calhoun. I'm sorry to come unannounced. I wasn't trying to listen, but I was riding by and He stopped. Looked at his hat for a moment, I heard. Clara Mae straightened her spine. "Then you've had an interesting morning." "Yes, ma'am." The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. Not quite a smile. "You mind if I ask that man they mentioned?" "Aldgate. He the one that owns the AA spread north of town?" Mae frowned. "He is. Why?" "Because I just came from there." Eli Calhoun turned his hat slowly in his hands. "I was looking for work. He offered me a position." "Congratulations," Clara Mae said, her tone careful. Ate down. He looked up at her. "I've heard of Thomas Aldgate." I don't work for men like that. A silence settled between them. Morning wind moved through the grass. Well, Clara Mae said finally. I don't know what that has to do with me. Maybe nothing. He glanced past her at the house, at the barn, at the acres of land stretching behind it. Maybe you're also looking for a hired hand. Maybe I'm looking for a place to work where a man's word still means something. He held her gaze. I'll work for fair wages and a place to sleep. I'll give you 60 days of my best work. And at the end of 60 days, you tell me if it wasn't worth it. Clara Mae looked at him for a long moment. She was 26 years old, and she had learned in 7 months of widowhood that the world was divided into people who saw her and people who looked at her. The ones who looked at her saw a stout, wide-hipped woman in a worn dress with rough hands and a dead husband's land. The ones who saw her saw something else, though. Clara Mae had mostly stopped expecting anyone to bother with the second category. This man, Eli Calhoun, with his dark eyes and his hat in his hands, she couldn't tell yet which kind he was. I'll pay you $40 a month, she said. And you'll sleep in the bunkhouse with Pete and Danny. No drinking on the property, no gambling. Work starts at sun. Yes, ma'am. And Mr. Calhoun. She stood up from the step, brushing the dust from her skirt. Run this ranch. Not you, not my hands, not the memory of my husband. Me. You work for me. You have a problem with that. You ride back the way you came. He looked at her directly, not through her, not past her. At her. No problem at all, he said. He was better than she'd expected. That was the first thing Clara Mae admitted to herself privately, about 10 days into Eli Calhoun's employment on the Sutton Ranch. She had expected competence. You didn't get a man who looked like that, who moved like that, without some degree of competence. But competence was common enough. What she hadn't expected was that he would work without being watched, make decisions without needing to be told, and fix problems she hadn't mentioned because she hadn't gotten around to mentioning them yet. He was out before Pete and Danny every morning. He stayed past dark most evenings. He didn't complain. He didn't offer opinions that hadn't been asked for. He disagreed with something, and he did. Twice in those first 10 days, he waited until they were alone, stated his disagreement plainly and quietly, and then did what she decided anyway. That was the part that surprised her most. James had been a good man in most ways that mattered. But James had also had very firm thoughts about how a ranch should be run, and those thoughts had not always been open to revision. Clara Mae had learned, in 5 years of marriage, to plant her suggestions like seeds carefully, in the right season, in ways that let James believe he'd grown them himself. It had been exhausting work, though she'd loved him well enough that she'd never called it exhausting until after he was gone. Eli just listened. He listened the way a man listened when he was actually trying to understand something, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. On the 12th day, she came out at mid-morning to find him on the roof of the hay barn, replacing a section of shingles she'd been meaning to address since April. I didn't ask you to do that, she called up. He looked down at her, squinting against the sun. No, ma'am, but it's going to rain by Thursday, and that section would have soaked through. How do you know it's going to rain by Thursday? Wind shifted this morning. Coming from the northeast, and the cloud formation to the west, he went back to the shingles. I could leave it if you'd prefer. You're already up there, she said. She stood in the yard for a moment, watching him work. Movements were economical, no wasted motion. Mr. Calhoun, she said. Ma'am, where did you work before this? A pause. The hammer kept moving, few different places. 6 years on a cattle drive out of Texas. 2 years managing a spread in Colorado before the owner sold out. Another pause. Went back to Texas for a while after that. Didn't stay. Why not? The hammer slowed, stopped. Personal reasons, he said. Clara Mae noted the border in his voice, the place where the answer ended and the private ground began, and she respected it, because she had borders of her own. All right, she said, and went back inside. That Thursday it rained. The problem with Millhaven was that it was a small town, and small towns notice things. They noticed that Eli Calhoun had turned down Thomas Aldgate's job offer. They noticed that he'd taken a position at the Sutton Ranch instead. And they discussed both facts with great enthusiasm at the hardware store, at the post office, and over supper tables from one end of the main street to the other. Clara Mae heard about the discussion secondhand. The way she heard about most things through Dottie Kramer, who ran the dry goods store and who had been Claire's closest friend since they were 7 years old, and had decided, together, that being sensible was more interesting than being fashionable. Reported. With the air of someone filing a very disappointing report, that the general opinion in Millhaven could be summarized as follows. Eli Calhoun was obviously a drifter of low character or limited judgment, possibly both, given that he'd chosen to work for a woman who couldn't manage her own finances, and that Clara Mae Sutton, Nan, God bless her, had never had the sense to understand what kind of woman she was, or what kind of situation she was in. Ruth Aldgate told Vera Mason that Thomas offered you full market value for the property, Dottie said, setting a paper package of buttons on the counter between them, and that you refused out of stubbornness. I refused because I'm not selling. Know that, Clara. Dottie leaned on the counter. You know how it sounds to people. Widow woman holding on to land she can't manage. I'm managing it. Alone. I have 2 hands. And a foreman. A foreman you hired 2 weeks ago and don't know from Adam. Dottie's voice softened. I'm not arguing with you, honey. I'm telling you what they're saying, so you know what you're walking into every time come to town. Clara Mae was quiet for a moment. She knew what she walked into every time she came to town. She had known it since she was 11 years old, and had first understood, with the particular clarity of a child who hears something she wasn't supposed to hear, that the women in Millhaven viewed her differently than they viewed other girls. Not with cruelty, most of them, just with a kind of sad pragmatism. As if they had already written the particular story of her life, and were simply waiting for her to catch up to the ending they'd already written. A girl like that won't have it easy, too heavy. Men around here want a woman who... She had stopped listening after that, but she'd carried the words anyway, the way you carry a stone in your shoe, aware of it always, adjusting your walk around it. I know what they're saying, Clara Mae told Dottie. I've always known. Dottie's eyes went soft in the way that Clara Mae both loved and found difficult to look at directly. You're stronger than most people would be, in your place. I'm not trying to be strong, Clara Mae said. I'm just trying to hold on to what James and I built. She picked up her package flour, thread, and a new lamp wick and walked back out into the Millhaven sun. She was crossing the main street, thinking about the south pasture fence, when she almost collided with Margaret Aldgate. Thomas Aldgate's wife was a tall, sharp-featured woman who wore her wealth the way other people wore a second skin effortlessly and with the unconscious assumption that everyone else found it as natural as she did. She stopped dead on the boardwalk and looked at Clara Mae with an expression that managed to convey concern, superiority, and pity in a single, carefully arranged expression. Mae, she said, I was hoping I'd run into you. Mrs. Aldgate. I heard about the bank notice. Margaret's voice dropped to the register of carefully performed discretion. We all did, of course. These things travel. She put one gloved hand briefly on Clara Mae's arm. Thomas wants you to know that his offer stands. Anytime you're ready. There's no shame in accepting help. I appreciate that, Mrs. Aldgate. It must be so hard. Margaret tilted her head. All alone out there, without James. Her eyes moved over Clara Mae not unkindly, but with that familiar evaluating quality, measuring and calculating. Some women just aren't made for that kind of life. It's nothing to be ashamed of. James was a capable man, but even capable men can't carry a place on their own, and she stopped. Smiled. A smile that finished the sentence without words. The sentence it finished was, and you are not capable at all. Unalone, Clara Mae said pleasantly. I have my hands and a new foreman who is quite good. We're making solid progress. Margaret blinked. That had not been the expected response. Yes. Still, she recovered smoothly. The offer stands. Clara Mae smiled. Good day, Mrs. Aldgate. She walked away at a steady pace, her packages under her arm, her face composed. It was only when she had turned the corner off Main Street that she allowed herself to feel the full burn of what Margaret Aldgate's unfinished sentence had done to her chest. She stood with her back against the wall of the feed store and breathed. Then she heard boots on the boardwalk and looked up to find Eli Calhoun coming around the corner, carrying a coil of rope and a box of fence staples. He stopped when he saw her face. "You all right?" he said. Not what's wrong, not what happened, just the direct question. "Fine," she said. "Uh-huh." He shifted the coil of rope on his shoulder. He didn't move to keep walking. Silence stretched out long enough that Clara Mae, against her better judgment, said, "I ran into Margaret Aldgate." "Ah, she told me there's no shame in accepting help." She meant accepting her husband's offer. "Yes, what'd you say?" "I said the offer stands and have a good day." The corner of his mouth moved. "It's remarkably polite. I've had years of practice." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those dark eyes in that steady, unhurried way of his. Then he said, "Mrs. Sutton, you know what I noticed first time I rode past your place?" Waited. The south field, the hay crop. He set the fence staples down on the boardwalk. Somebody cut it at exactly the right time, left enough stem to keep the root system healthy through the dry spell. That's not an accident. That's someone who knows what they're doing. He picked the box back up. Most people I've worked for couldn't tell you the right time to cut hay if their lives depended on it. Mae looked at him. "I cut that hay," she said. "I know," he said. He started walking, then over his shoulder, "Ready when you are." Wagon's out front. Clara Mae stood for another moment after he'd rounded the corner. She had no words for what she was feeling exactly. It was something unfamiliar, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a very long time. She straightened her packages under her arm and followed him. The situation shifted in the third week. Thomas Aldgate came to the ranch himself. He came on a Sunday afternoon, which was either calculated or insulting. Clara Mae couldn't decide which. He was a big man, not fat, but large in the particular way of men who had never had to accommodate themselves to anyone else's comfort. He had a full gray beard and the posture of a man who expected doors to open before he reached them. He arrived alone, which surprised her. She met him on the porch. "Widow Sutton," he said, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not disturbing your Sunday." "Mr. Aldgate." She did not invite him to sit. "What can I do for you?" He looked around the property. She watched him do it, the slow, proprietary look of a man who had already decided he owned something and was merely waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "Ace," he said. "James kept it well. I keep it now." He turned his look back to her. A pause. "I also hear you've taken on a foreman. Calhoun, is it?" "That's right. He worked for a man named Porter in Colorado." Before Porter's spread went under, Aldgate's tone was pleasant, conversational. "I heard some things about that situation." Something moved in Clara Mae's chest. Not quite alarm. More like the feeling of standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of. "I haven't asked about Mr. Calhoun's past," she said carefully. "He works hard and he's honest. Most men seem honest at first." Aldgate put his hat back on. "My offer is $900 for the full property. You know, I owe $940 to the bank." He said it simply, without apology, which meant his offer wasn't meant to help her. It was meant to leave her with a $40 shortfall and no ranch. "No," Clara Mae said. "Think carefully, Mrs. Sutton." "I have thought." "No." He studied her for a long, considering moment. Then he nodded once. "I'll leave the offer open." He turned toward his horse. "Offers don't stay open forever, and trouble has a way of finding places that aren't well managed." "Nay." He rode away. Clara Mae stood on her porch and watched him go, and, when she turned around, Eli Calhoun was standing in the doorway of the barn, leaning against the frame, watching her. She walked across the yard to him. "You heard," she said. "Enough." His voice was even. He was watching the road where Aldgate had gone. He mentioned Colorado. A stillness moved through him. Not tension, exactly. More like a man setting something down that he'd been carrying for a while. I figured he might, he said, or somebody working for him would. You don't have to tell me anything, Clara Mae said. What you did before you came here is your own business. He looked at her then. Porter's ranch went under because Porter made bad choices, he said. I worked for him for 2 years and I disagreed with those choices and I said so. When things got bad, he blamed the men who'd warned him. A pause. There's nothing else. She looked at him for a long moment. The thing about working alongside a person, the real kind of working, sunup to sundown, with all the difficult and unglamorous parts included, was that you learned things about their character that no story could either manufacture or destroy. She had watched Eli Calhoun for 3 weeks. She had watched how he treated Pete and Danny, who were 16 and easily impressed and sometimes made mistakes. She had watched how he spoke to the horses. She had watched how he said, "I'll handle it" when something went wrong, and then actually handled it, without complaint. She made her decision in the space of a breath. "All right," she said. "I believe you." He exhaled, very slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Sutton." He looked at her. "My name is Clara Mae," she said. "After 3 weeks, I think you've earned the right to use it." Something shifted in his face. That almost smile again, but warmer this time, like sunlight through cloud cover. "Clara Mae," he said. And that was how in the 4th week things began to change. She hadn't meant for it to happen. She had been deeply and genuinely sure when she hired him that her heart was finished with the particular business of caring about people in ways that left her exposed. James had taken enough of her when he left, not through any fault of his own. But death had a way of withdrawing things you hadn't known you'd deposited. But there was an evening, on the 28th day. She knew it was the 28th because she'd been counting the weeks left until the bank's deadline when she came back from checking the north fence at dusk and found Eli sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee. He had brought 2 cups. She sat down beside him without saying anything, and he handed her the second cup, and they sat together in the cooling evening air and watched the sky go from orange to purple to the first particular dark blue that meant real night was coming. And neither of them said a word for a full 10 minutes. It was the most peaceful she'd felt since October. "Ask you something?" she said finally. "You can ask. Why did you really turn down Aldgate's offer? You could have had a paying position the day you rode into Millhaven. You didn't know me. You didn't know this ranch." She looked at her cup. "You took a risk coming here." He was quiet for a moment. "I've worked for men like Aldgate before," he said. "Learn to recognize them." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "And I'd been riding a long time looking for." He stopped. "For what?" He looked out at the darkening land. "Something that felt like it mattered," he said. "Work that meant something. A place where the right thing was happening, even if it was hard." Clara Mae was quiet. "James used to say this land was worth fighting for," she said. He said his father had broken his back to buy it, and his grandfather before that had broken his back in a different way, and that every generation owed the next one something worth inheriting. It was right. I know. She looked out at the land too, her land. Her weight, her responsibility, her inheritance and her debt all at once. "I'm not going to lose it." "No," Eli Calhoun said. "You're not." He said it with the quietness of certainty. "Not a promise, exactly. Something more settled than that." And in the gathering dark of the Wyoming evening, sitting on the porch steps of the home she refused to surrender, Clara Mae Sutton felt, the first time in 7 months, 2 weeks, and 28 days, that she was not entirely alone. She did not know yet what that meant. She only knew that she was grateful for it. And that she was going to do whatever it took to hold on. Ranch. To the land. To whatever this quiet, steady thing was that had appeared, unexpected and unasked for, at her gate one morning, with its hat in its hands. She was going to hold on. The morning after Thomas Aldgate rode away from the Sutton Ranch, Clara Mae woke before sunup and lay in the dark for exactly 3 minutes, staring at the ceiling. Doing the arithmetic she had already done 40 times and always arrived at the same place. $940. She had $212 in the tin box under the floorboard beneath her bed. A. She had the promise of $60 from the Hendersons for the 2 heifers she was selling at the end of the month. She had the Southfield hay crop, which she could sell at market if she cut it at exactly the right time, which might bring her another $180 if the price held. Was $452, which left her $488 short. In 26 days, she got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her, and she went through every number one more time, looking for something she'd missed. Column that would add up differently if she stared at it long enough. Nothing added up differently. She closed the ledger when she heard the bunkhouse door, which meant Eli was already up, which meant she had maybe 15 minutes before Pete and Danny stumbled out behind him, and the day began whether she was ready for it or not. She took her coffee and her ledger to the porch. Eli was crossing the yard from the bunkhouse, his boots already on, his hat settled, so moving with that particular self-contained economy of motion that she'd stopped noticing until she noticed it again. He looked up and saw her sitting there and altered his direction without breaking stride, coming toward the porch with something already in his expression, a question he hadn't asked yet. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "You're up early." "I didn't really sleep." He looked at the ledger on the table beside her. He didn't ask, he waited, which was either the most respectful thing a person could do or the most infuriating, and she had been going back and forth on which one for the better part of 3 weeks. "I'm $488 short," she said. "I've gone through every number I have." He sat down on the bottom step. He didn't say anything immediately, which she had also learned was his way. He didn't speak until he had something worth saying. "The Reardon brothers," he said finally. "They've got 200 head they need moved to their winter pasture in 12 days. I heard it in town when I went for the staples." Clara Mae looked at him. "That's full day's drive. For 2 men, yes. Off hands, you could do it in one push." He turned his hat slowly. "They're paying $8 a head." She did the arithmetic before he finished speaking. $1,600. Divided by the cost of the extra hands you'd need to hire, and whatever the Riordans negotiate down. Puts you in range. She was quiet for a moment. "Why do the Riordans need outside help? They have their own men. 3 of their regular hands left last month. Dispute over wages, from what I heard." He looked out toward the road. "And they need it before the first freeze, which means they're running out of options. They'll negotiate hard, probably. And I'll need at least 4 additional riders for a push like that. I know 2 men in town who are between jobs. I've worked with one of them before. He's solid." He paused. "The other one I wouldn't trust with a fence post, but he's available." Everything. Clara Mae felt something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "One solid man," he agreed. "I'll ride to the Reardon place today," she said. He nodded. Then, looking at his hat, "They'll try to deal with me instead of you." "When we get there." Her jaw tightened. "I know, I'll make sure they don't." "Nair." She looked at him. Nay, he was still looking at his hat, turning it slowly in his hands, and something about the simplicity of it, the plain, of fact way, he said it, without any performance of chivalry or condescension, made that tight thing in her chest loosen, just slightly. "All right," she said. "We leave at 8. She was right about the Riordans. There were 2 of them. Clement, who was the older brother and ran the business side, and Harold, who was younger and louder, and had the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no often enough. They met Clara Mae and Eli in the yard of the Reardon main house, and Clement shook Eli's hand before he looked at Clara Mae, and Harold did the same. And then both of them turned back to Eli as if Clara Mae were a piece of furniture that had arrived at an inconvenient time. "Calhoun," Clement said. "Heard you were working at the Sutton place. Glad you came out. We've got a situation, and we need—" "You'll want to address Mrs. Sutton," Eli said. His voice was the same easy, unhurried tone it always was. "It's her operation. She's the one making the decisions." Clement blinked. Harold looked at Clara Mae with the expression of a man seeing something he hadn't expected to see and wasn't sure how to categorize. "Mrs. Sutton," Clement said, after a moment's recalibration. "Apologies, ma'am." Clara Mae did not let any of it show on her face. "Mr. Reardon, I understand you need 200 head moved to your winter pasture in the next 12 days. That's right. We had some trouble with our regular crew, and we're running short on time. I can provide the drive," Clara Mae said. "Full crew, competent riders, well managed from start to finish. We can complete the push in a single day with a pre-dawn start." Nodded slowly. "What are you asking?" $6 a head. Harold made a sound. "That's steep. That's the price," Clara Mae said pleasantly. "You're short on time, and short on options, Mr. Reardon. I'm offering you a solved problem. If you'd like to shop for a better price, I respect that, but the freeze is coming in what I'd estimate is 9 to 11 days, and I don't see another operation ready to move on your timeline." A silence settled over the yard. Clement looked at Eli. Eli looked at the middle distance, in the way of a man who was present but had absolutely nothing to add. "50, Clement said. $5.75, Clara Mae said. "And that is where I stop." "Done," Clement said. It was $1,150. Yeah, not as much as the full 8. Enough. With everything else she had, clear the banknote and have something left. She kept her face composed all the way through the handshake, all the way through the discussion of logistics, all the way back through the gate and onto the road toward home. Then she exhaled so hard her shoulders dropped 2 inches. "Ebb 75, Eli said. He was riding just behind her left shoulder, and she could hear something in his voice that was working hard not to be a smile. "It would have taken 550, she said. "I know." Now it was definitely a smile. But he didn't. She let out a breath that might have been a laugh and urged her horse forward, and for one small, bright moment, on the road back to Millhaven, everything felt possible. She should have known it wouldn't last. The trouble started 3 days before the drive. Pete came to find her in the early afternoon. And the look on his face, Pete, who was 16 and generally cheerful, and approached most problems with the blunt optimisms of someone who hadn't yet accumulated enough experience to know better, was enough to stop her where she stood. "What?" she said. "Somebody cut the fence on the east pasture," he said. "The cattle have been out since morning. We didn't find it until now because they scattered toward the creek." She was already moving before he finished speaking. It took them 4 hours to find and recover the herd. 4 hours in the afternoon heat, Eli and Pete and Danny riding in wide circles, pushing cattle back through a gap in the fence that had clearly been cut with wire cutters. No snapping, no rust, no weathering. A cut, deliberately placed where the fence was hardest to see from the house and the main barn. When the last heifer was back inside and the fence was patched, Clara Mae stood at the repair section and looked at it for a long time. "Wasn't an accident," she said. "No," Eli said. He was standing beside her, looking at the same cut ends of wire. "The Reardon drive is in 3 days, yes. If the cattle had been scattered overnight, if we hadn't found them today, you'd have lost 2 or 3 head minimum, maybe more." He paused. "And you'd be a day behind on everything." She looked at him. Who knew about the Reardon contract? Clement Reardon Harold, whatever hands they have left. He was quiet for a moment. And anyone in town those men might have mentioned it to. Thomas Aldgate's face moved through her mind. She didn't say his name out loud. "Didn't have to. I'm putting Danny on night watch," she said. "Hour rotations. Starting tonight, I'll take the first watch myself." She started to say it wasn't necessary. She stopped herself. Because it was necessary, arguing about it would waste time she didn't have, and she had learned in the 4 weeks since Eli Calhoun had come to work for her that he didn't offer things he wasn't prepared to follow through on. 4 to 6 in the morning is the worst stretch," she said. That's when a person gets tired enough to make mistakes." "I'll take 4 to 6, he said. She nodded. Because it needed to be said, and she wasn't good at saying things that needed to be said, Eli. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for this." For all of it. He was quiet for a moment. The evening light was doing something complicated with the shadows between them. "It's my job," he said finally. "It's more than the job," she said. "We both know it." He held her gaze for one long, still beat. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." Then Pete called from across the field about something with the water trough. And the moment broke the way moments did on a working ranch, abruptly and without apology, and they walked back towards the barn in the settling dark. She didn't sleep much that night either. The night before the Reardon drive, Dottie Kramer came out to the ranch for the first time since winter. This was unusual enough that Clara Mae met her at the gate with her hand on the fence post and her pulse doing something she didn't appreciate. Dottie climbed down from her wagon with the expression of someone who had been rehearsing a difficult conversation and had changed her mind 3 times about how to start it. Clara Mae said, "I'll get coffee." "Don't get coffee," Dottie said. "I have to say this before I lose my nerve." Clara Mae waited. Dottie pulled her shawl tighter, which she did when she was uncomfortable, which Clara Mae had known since they were 7. "Ruth Aldgate was in my store today," she said. "Thomas Aldgate's wife." And she said something that I've been thinking about since she said it, and I think you need to know." "What did she say?" "She said Thomas is planning to go back to the bank." Dottie's voice dropped, even though there was no one for miles who could hear. "Not to buy your note." Clara Mae went very still. "That. The 30-day notice. He's on the board of the Territorial Bank, Clara. He's been on it for 6 years. Dottie looked at her with the helpless expression of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. Ruth said, "He's been speaking to Harlan Briggs about accelerating the timeline. Something about a procedural clause in the original loan agreement." "The original loan agreement was with James," Clara Mae said. Her voice was very even. "And when James died, the obligation transferred to the estate. Which is you." Dottie paused. Ruth was saying it like she thought it was practical. Like it would be better for everyone if it was resolved quickly. Dottie stopped. "What did she say?" "She said it would be kinder. You. To let you move on before you lost any more." Dottie's voice went tight at the edges. "Like she was doing you a favor." The things that moved through Clara Mae in the next several seconds were not suitable for conversation, so she didn't try to put them into words. She stood at her gate and breathed and organized everything she felt into its proper place, which was what she did when the feeling was too large for the moment it arrived in. Then she heard the bunkhouse door and Eli's boots on the hard ground. He came around the corner, took one look at her face, and stopped. "What happened?" she told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to rely on more than she'd ever intended to the way he received information. All of it, before he responded to any of it. When she finished, he said when. Dottie doesn't know exactly. Noon, before the 30 days. He looked at Dottie. "Thank you for coming out, ma'am." Dottie looked at him, with the sharp, measuring expression that Clara Mae recognized as Dottie deciding whether a person was trustworthy. It usually took longer. With Eli, it seemed to take about 8 seconds. Dottie said. Then to Clara Mae, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to do the Reardon drive tomorrow," Clara Mae said. "And then I'm going to the bank. And if Briggs has already moved on the timeline, then I'll deal with that when I know it's happened." She looked at Dottie steadily. "I can't fight something I can't see yet, but I can make sure I have money in hand when I walk through that door." Dottie studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into her wagon and produced a small cloth pouch that she set on the fence post between them. $115, Dottie said. "My savings from the last 2 years. Don't argue with me about it." Clara Mae looked at the pouch. At Dottie. "Dottie, don't." Dottie's voice was firm. "James was my friend too, and you are my oldest friend. I am tired of watching this town act like you don't deserve to keep what's yours." She pushed the pouch an inch closer. "Take it." Clara Mae took it. Her throat was doing something she didn't have time for, so she put her arms around Dottie and held on for a moment, brief and fierce. "I'll pay you back," she said into Dottie's shoulder. "Obviously," Dottie said, with interest. After Dottie's wagon disappeared down the road, Clara Mae stood in the yard in the last of the evening light and held the small cloth pouch and did the new arithmetic. 212 in the tin box, 60 from the Henderson heifers, and 180 from the hay sale if the price held. 115 from Dottie, and tomorrow's drive, which would bring 1,150. That was $1,717. She owed $940 if she could get to the bank before Aldgate moved. If the drive went clean, if nothing else went wrong. Eli was watching her face. He had gotten very good at reading the arithmetic on her face, which she found alternately comforting and alarming. "Enough," she said, "if we're in time." "We'll be in time," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but we'll push like we do." She looked at him. In the cooling evening, with everything balanced on the edge of tomorrow, with the pouch warm in her hand, and the drive ahead, and Aldgate somewhere in Millhaven making plans she couldn't see yet, she looked at Eli Calhoun and felt something she recognized as dangerous. Not the situation. The situation was dangerous in the ordinary way of difficult things. What she felt when she looked at him was a different kind of dangerous. The kind that had to do with trust, and the particular vulnerability of trusting someone when you had already lost someone once, and the terror of what it meant if you did it again and the world took that person too. "Get some sleep," she said. "Drive starts at 4. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't move immediately. She could feel him looking at the side of her face, the way she'd felt him looking at her that first morning on the porch steps, with that steady, unhurried attention that didn't demand anything. Then his boots moved away across the yard, and she heard the bunkhouse door, and she was alone in the evening, with the weight of everything that mattered balanced in one small cloth pouch, and the day that was coming. The Reardon drive was the hardest single day's work Clara Mae had done since the winter James died. They were in the saddle before 4 in the morning, and the cattle were moving by first light, and for the next 14 hours Clara Mae existed in the purely physical world of noise and dust, and the constant, muscle-burning work of keeping 200 head moving in the same direction on a schedule. The 2 additional riders Eli had arranged a quiet, weathered man named Bo Strickland, who was exactly as competent as advertised, and a young man named Corby, who was not as competent, but tried harder than anyone to compensate, held the flanks while Eli and Pete and Danny worked the tail. Clara Mae, road point, which she had insisted on, over Eli's brief and quickly abandoned objection, because she was the one who knew the Reardon land, having ridden its borders twice in preparation. And because the woman running this operation needed to be visible at its front. By midday, they were 2/3 of the way through. By 3 in the afternoon, the lead cattle were through the gate of the winter pasture. By 5 the count was done, and Clement Reardon stood at the gate with his hat in his hand, looking at Clara Mae with an expression she hadn't seen from a Millhaven man in a long time. Respect, clean and uncomplicated and directed straight at her. "Mrs. Sutton," he said. "That was one of the cleanest drives I've seen on this route in 20 years. "Thank you, Mr. Reardon." She was covered in dust. Every muscle in her body was already informing her of exactly how angry it was going to be tomorrow. She held out her hand. "The payment, if you're ready." He paid her in cash on the spot. Clement Reardon was at least a man who paid what he owed when he owed it, and she put the folded bills inside her coat and said goodbye and turned her horse toward home. Was going down behind the mountains when she and Eli rode the last mile to the Sutton ranch. Neither of them had spoken much on the ride back, not because there was nothing to say, but because the kind of tiredness that followed a full cattle drive was the kind that sat in your bones and made words feel more expensive than they were worth. When they reached the gate, Eli said, "You did something today." He looked at him, tired, dusty, every inch of her wanting a bath and 12 hours of sleep. "I moved cattle," she said. "Clement Reardon will tell that story," Eli said. "The way it was, who ran the drive, what it looked like." He paused. "That matters." She thought about Margaret Aldgate's unfinished sentence. She thought about Harlan Briggs, looking her over and weighing her, and finding her insufficient. She thought about what it meant to have a story told straight, by someone with no reason to change it. "I'll go to the bank tomorrow," she said. "I'll ride with you." "You don't have." "I know I don't have to," he said, with a patience that was not impatience at all. "I want to." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. She was off her horse, and halfway to the house, when he said her name. "Clara Mae." She turned. He was still on his horse, looking at her across the yard with the last of the evening light, doing something she didn't want to think too hard about to his face. "Hey, for what it's worth," he said. "What you've done in the last 4 weeks, the way you've run this place, the way you've fought for it." He stopped. Again. "James was right to love this land. You're the reason it's worth saving." The words hit her somewhere she wasn't defended against. She didn't say anything for a moment. The yard was quiet. The horses were settling. Somewhere behind the barn, Pete was whistling something tuneless. "Eli," she said. "Good night, Clara Mae," he said. He went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table in the dark without lighting the lamp and put her face in her hands, and this time, finally, she cried. Not from grief exactly, not from fear, from something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Nay. She pressed her hands against her eyes and breathed through it, and when it was done she sat up straight and lit the lamp and opened the ledger and counted the money one more time. $1,717. Tomorrow, she would go to the bank, and then she would know exactly what she had left to fight. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. She did not sleep easily. Because sometime in the last 4 weeks, without her permission or her planning, Eli Calhoun had become something she could not afford to lose, and she did not yet know what to do with that knowledge, only that it was true. That the truth of it frightened her more than Thomas Aldgate and Harlan Briggs and the bank notice and all the rest of it put together. She lay in the dark above the tin box with its counted and recounted bills and thought about the particular risk of caring and the particular cost of not caring, and did not arrive at any useful conclusion before sleep finally took her. She woke before dawn, and in the first gray light of morning, she heard something that brought her out of bed and to the window in 3 quick steps. Riders, coming up the road from town, not 2 this time. 5, and in the center of them on his fine bay horse was Harlan Briggs. Beside him, on a black horse Clara Mae had never seen before, was a man in a dark coat that was not the coat of anyone from Millhaven. And beside that man, riding with the comfortable assurance of a man who had already won the argument, was Thomas Aldgate. Clara Mae dressed in 45 seconds. She had the ledger, the cash, and her boots on before she heard Eli's boots already crossing the yard. He'd seen them too, or heard them. And she didn't have time to wonder which. It was out the door and on the porch when the riders pulled up. Briggs cleared his throat. "Widow Sutton," he said. "I apologize for the early hour." "I doubt that," Clara Mae said. Briggs had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "This is Mr. Gerard Hollins. He's a legal representative of the Territorial Bank's Western Board." He gestured to the man in the dark coat. "We've reviewed your loan agreement and determined that under Clause 14 of the original terms, the bank reserves the right to call the note in full upon a material change in the borrower's circumstances." Clara Mae's hands tightened on the ledger she was holding against her chest. "What material change?" she said. Briggs looked at his papers. "The death of the primary borrower, James Sutton, represents a material change in the bank's assessment of risk." "James died 7 months ago," Clara Mae said. "You've been accepting my payments for 7 months. The clause was reviewed in light of recent concerns regarding the property's management." "Whose concerns?" Briggs did not look at Thomas Aldgate. Thomas Aldgate looked at Clara Mae with the expression of a man who had planned for exactly this response. Behind her, she heard Eli come up the porch steps and stop just behind her right shoulder. "Mrs. Sutton," Ann Hollins said, opening his case, "if you cannot produce the full sum of $940 this morning, the bank will be compelled to begin repossession proceedings immediately." Looked at the man in the dark coat. Then she opened her ledger. "How much?" she said. "I just stated." "How much?" she said again to the dollar. "Right now." Hollins looked at his papers. $940. As stated in the original. May reached into the ledger and produced the folded bills from the Reardon Drive, from the Henderson heifers, from the hay sale, from the tin box, from Dottie's cloth pouch. She counted it onto the flat surface of the ledger, bill by bill, in the early morning light, with 5 men watching. $940. She held the ledger out toward Hollins. "Count it," she said. Gerard Hollins counted the money twice. The first time, his fingers moved through the bills with the practiced speed of a man who handled large sums regularly, and his face gave nothing away. The second time, he counted more slowly, and Clara Mae watched his expression do something small and involuntary, a tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the mouth that told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. $940, he said. Exact. Briggs made a sound in his throat. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of a plan failing. Thomas Aldgate didn't make any sound at all. He sat on his black horse and looked at Clara Mae with the particular stillness of a man recalculating. "You'll want to provide a receipt," Eli said, from behind her shoulder. His voice was conversational, polite even, dated and signed, with the full amount noted and the loan marked satisfied. Hollins looked at him, then at Briggs. Briggs looked at Hollins. "Of course," Hollins said. He opened his case and produced a form, and he filled it out on the flat surface of the case balanced on his knee, and he handed it to Clara Mae, and Clara Mae read every word of it before she folded it and put it inside the ledger. Then she looked at Thomas Aldgate. He was still looking at her. And there was something in his expression now that she hadn't seen from him before, not anger, not contempt, but something colder and more patient. The expression of a man who was very comfortable with the long game. "And congratulations, Mrs. Sutton," he said. His tone made congratulations sound like a temporary condition. "Good morning, Mr. Aldgate," she said, "gentlemen." She went inside and closed the door. She stood in the kitchen with the ledger pressed against her chest and listened to the sound of 5 horses moving away from her gate, and she breathed, and she waited until the sound was gone. And then she set the ledger on the table and put both hands flat on the surface and stayed there for a moment. Door opened. Eli came in without knocking, which he had never done before. He closed the door behind him. "You all right?" he said. "I paid the debt," she said.
"Two that's done."
"Yes. He's going to find another way, probably." She lifted her head and looked at him. That didn't sound like a man who was finished. "No," Eli said. "It didn't." He crossed the stove and picked up the coffee pot, and he poured 2 cups without being asked, because in 5 weeks he had learned where the cups were and how she took it. And he set one in front of her, and kept one for himself, and sat down across the table. "Tell me what you know about Aldgate," he said. "All of it." "Not what the town says, what you know." She sat down. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "He came to Millhaven 14 years ago," she said. "Money from somewhere back east. No one ever knew the specifics. He bought the Davison spread when old Earl Davison died without an heir, and then 3 years later he bought the Pierce land when Frank Pierce had a bad drought and couldn't recover. Then the Connolly place, same way, bad luck and a note called early." She paused. He doesn't steal anything. He waits for trouble, and then he arrives with an offer just before everything gets worse." Eli was quiet for a moment. "So he creates the trouble." "I can't prove it. The fence that was cut, I can't prove it. Bank's timeline being accelerated. I can't." "Clara Mae," his voice was steady. "You don't have to prove it to me." "I'm asking what you believe." She looked at him across the table. "I believe Thomas Aldgate has been waiting for this ranch for years," she said. "I believe he let James borrow against the land because he knew the drought was coming, the same way he knew about the Davison drought and the Pierce drought. Men with money and connections hear about drought assessments before anyone else does. And I believe he's had people watching this property since the day James died." She stopped. And I believe that whatever he said this morning, whatever that look on his face, was I am not done with Thomas Aldgate. Eli nodded slowly. Then we need to know more about what he's actually holding. Legally. What do you mean? You paid the banknote. That's gone. So whatever he tries next, it can't be the bank. He turned his cup slowly. He mentioned the legal papers in front of Hollins this morning. Wanted Hollins to see something. He wanted you to know he had a next move without showing you what it was. Clara Mae went very still. The water rights, she said. Eli looked at her. James's agreement with the bank when he originally bought the land from the territorial survey. There was a separate filing for the water rights on the creek that runs along the east border. She's pressed her fingers to her temple. James handled it. I didn't read the full filing because James said it was standard. I didn't look at it closely because I trusted. She stopped. Where are the papers? James kept everything in the strongbox in the barn. They were both out of their chairs before she finished the sentence. The strongbox was exactly where it had always been, behind the loose board under the workbench in the far corner of the barn. Clara Mae had known about it since the first winter of their marriage. She had never had reason to look inside it closely, because James had always been the one who managed the formal side of things, and she had let him. And she had not understood until she stood here now what it meant to have let someone else hold the paperwork on everything that mattered. She lifted the lid. There were documents in 3 rubber-banded stacks. She went through them with her fingers moving fast, reading headings, flipping pages. Eli stood beside her and held the lantern. The water rights filing was in the second stack. Once. Then she went back to the top and read it again more slowly. What you see, Eli said. The original survey filed the water rights jointly. Her voice was very flat. James stopped. Eli waited. Thomas Aldgate, she said. Lantern light was very still. Joint water rights on the creek, she said. Filed in 1877. 4 years before we married. James must have needed a cosigner for the survey filing. He didn't have the full standing yet as a new landowner. She turned the page. Her hands were steady, only because she was making them be steady. Structured, so that either party can petition the court to resolve the joint hold. Which means Aldgate can petition, which means he can argue that with James dead, the joint filing creates an ambiguous ownership situation, and he can ask a court to give him first claim, Eli said, or force a buyout at a price he sets. She closed the folder. And without the water rights on the creek, the south and east pastures are worth half what they are. Maybe less. The cattle can't graze without the creek in summer. She set the folder on the workbench and stood with her back to the strongbox and looked at the barn ceiling and breathed. He doesn't need the bank, she said. He never needed the bank. The bank was just to wear me down. The water rights are the actual play. When could he file? She looked at Eli. Might already have. Eli set the lantern down on the workbench. Lawyer. I can't afford a lawyer. I just handed over every dollar I had to the bank. I know someone, he said. She looked at him. His name is Calvin Price. He practiced land law in Denver before he retired to Garrisonship, 2 hours east. Eli's voice was measured. He's not cheap, but he knows water rights cases in this territory better than anyone I've ever met, and he's the kind of man who doesn't like watching someone get squeezed out of what's theirs. A pause, small but real. He helped me once, Eli said. A situation in Colorado. He didn't take full payment. He said I could call it even if I ever needed to. He looked at her directly. I've never called it. Something moved through Clara Mae that she didn't entirely have a name for. The picture of Eli that lived in her mind, the quiet man with his hat in his hands at her gate, the steady presence that had arrived when she needed it rearranged itself slightly, taking in this new thing. It held in reserve, kept for 5 years, maybe more, and never spent. You'd use it for this, she said. For me. For what's right, he said. And then more quietly, same thing. Nay, he picked up the water rights folder and held it against her chest. Ride to Garrison, she said. He was saddled and on the road within 20 minutes. The day that followed was the longest Clara Mae could remember since the day James died. She set Pete and Danny to work on the south fence. There was always south fence to work on, and she went through every document in the strongbox one more time, looking for anything she'd missed the first time, anything that changed the picture. She ate a list of every piece of land around hers, who held it when they'd bought it. She pulled out the original survey map that James had filed with the county and spread it on the kitchen table and traced the creek line with her finger, all the way from where it crossed onto Sutton land to where it crossed back off, trying to understand exactly how much leverage Thomas Aldgate had built into one filing that she had never read closely enough. Dottie came by at noon without being asked, which meant Dottie had heard something. Ruth Aldgate was in the store again this morning, Dottie said, setting a basket on the kitchen. She bought absolutely nothing and talked for 45 minutes. What did she say? That Thomas is very patient, and that things have a way of working themselves out. Dottie sat down. And then she said that some women simply aren't meant to be landowners, and that it wasn't a judgment, just a practical observation. She's a practical woman, Clara Mae said. She's a mouthpiece, Dottie said, with a precision that Clara Mae found bracing. What did you find in the strongbox? Clara Mae told her about the water rights filing. Dottie was quiet for a longer moment than usual, which meant she understood what it meant. Oh, Claire, she said, I've sent Eli to Garrison to find a land lawyer named Calvin Price. Dottie blinked. Eli knows a land lawyer, apparently. In Garrison. Yes. Dottie looked at her with an expression that Clara Mae recognized as Dottie deciding not to say something. Nothing, Dottie said. Only that you trust him. I do. Without question, I have questions, Clara Mae said. She stopped. He's earned it. He's been here 6 weeks, and he's worked every day, and made every decision like this ranch was his own, and never once tried to take anything with me or talk over me or decide something without asking first. She looked at Dottie. That's not, he nodded slowly. No, she said. It's not a good man. He might be, Dottie said. I think he is. A pause. I also think there's something you're not saying about how you feel about that. Clara Mae looked at the survey map on the table. Eat your lunch, she said. Dottie opened the basket. Neither of them said anything else about it. It sat between them like a warm thing for the rest of the afternoon. Eli came back from Garrison at 9 that night. Clara Mae heard his horse before she saw him because she had been sitting on the porch in the dark for the last hour, which she would not have admitted to anyone. She stood up when he came through the gate, and she waited, reading his posture, in trying to determine the news before he delivered it. His posture told her the situation was complicated. Which was different from hopeless but only slightly more comfortable. He came up the porch steps and handed her a folded letter. Price wrote that for you, he said. He explained the legal situation in full. But I'll give you the plain version first. Please. Sat on the top step. She stayed standing. Aldgate hasn't filed yet, Eli said. Price checked with the county clerk in Garrison. They'd have a record if anything was filed in the territorial system, and nothing has been. Which means he's either waiting for something or he's still preparing. Or he wants me to know he could file, Clara Mae said. Which is its own kind of pressure. Eli nodded. The joint water rights filing from 1877 is real, and it's valid. Price says Aldgate absolutely has standing to petition, and if he does, the case would likely go to the territorial court in Cheyenne, which could take months, or longer. And while it's in court, Price says strong argument that the usage of the water rights would be frozen pending resolution. Means the cattle can't graze the east and south pastures in summer, Clara Mae said. Which means I can't run the herd at full capacity. Which means the ranch isn't profitable. Which means I can't make any other payments or expenses. She pressed her lips together. And then something else breaks. Yes. Can we challenge the filing directly? Price says there's a path. Eli looked at the letter in her hand. Man, In 1877, when James co-signed with Aldgate, there's a question of consideration what Aldgate provided in exchange for his name on the filing. Price read the original document, and he says Aldgate's contribution was recorded as, quote, financial surety and territorial standing, which is vague enough that it might be challenged as insufficient for a full joint holding claim. What does that mean in language I can use? It means Aldgate may have put his name on the filing without actually giving James anything of real value in return. Just the loan of his standing. Which might mean the joint claim was never fully legitimate. Eli looked up at her. Nutre says, if you can prove James never received any material benefit from the co-signing arrangement, no money, no services, no resources, you could argue the filing was nominal, not contractual. Clara Mae stared at him. James's ledgers, she said. That's what I thought, Eli said. She was already turning toward the door. Ledgers went back to 1875. James had kept them the way. He kept, in his careful, tight handwriting, every dollar in and out recorded with a one-line description. It was one of the things she had loved about him. It was one of the things she had found hardest to look at after he died, because his handwriting was so deeply, entirely him. She started with 1877. Eli sat across the table, and she handed him pages as she finished them, and together they went through 6 months of transactions, January through June of 1877. The months around the water rights filing, looking for any entry that suggested Aldgate had provided something of value. At 12 minutes past 10, Clara Mae turned a page and went still. Eli said. She turned the ledger so he could see. Her finger was on an entry dated April 3, 1877. Territorial survey fee. A to A. James. Eli read it twice. He paid the survey fee himself, Clara Mae said. Her voice was very quiet. No, debt to A, that's Aldgate. James was recording in his own hand that he owed Aldgate nothing for the co-signing, which means he understood at the time that the arrangement was nominal, which means he documented it at the time, which means Price can argue Aldgate's claim is nominal, not contractual. She looked up at Eli. This is it. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something beyond the usual steadiness, something that was, she thought, as close to relief as a man like Eli Calhoun allowed himself to show. James was smart, he said. James was very smart, she said. He just needed a little more time than he got. She closed the ledger gently, the way you close something precious. A silence settled over the kitchen. The lamp burned low between them. Outside, somewhere far off, an animal moved through the dark. The house creaked once, its old wood settling. Eli, she said. He looked at her. In Colorado, she said, the situation you mentioned. One Price helped you with. She kept her voice even. Will you tell me what it was? The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I was engaged to be married. She had not expected that. She kept her face still. Her name was Rose, he said. I'd known her for 3 years. We were going to have a place of our own, small spread, nothing grand but ours. He turned his cup on the table. He wasn't looking at her. The man I worked for, Porter, in Colorado, he owed money to a lot of people. When things went bad, he started claiming that ranch assets belonged to him personally, even though some of them had been purchased with wages owed to his men. Including me. A pause. He went after the claim on a piece of land I'd been buying gradually, payment by payment. It was part of the ranch property, not mine. That was your land, Clara Mae said. Legally, in his argument, it was disputed. Eli was quiet for a moment. Price helped me fight it. I won, but it took 14 months and all the money I had, and the money I should have been saving. Rose, he stopped, started again. She was a practical woman. She decided 14 months was too long to wait for a life to begin. Clara Mae sat very still. She left. He said it without bitterness. With the flatness of something that'd been looked at so many times it had worn smooth. She married a man in Denver who already had a house and a future that wasn't in dispute. Don't blame her. He finally looked up. I blamed myself for a while. for not being further along, for not having enough to hold on to. And then I stopped. He held her gaze. Price said something to me when it was all done. He said the land was worth fighting for because it was mine, and I'd earned it. Not because of what someone else thought about the fight. He paused. I think about that a lot. Clara Mae looked at this man across her kitchen table, this man who had ridden in off the road with his hat in his hands and stayed and worked and held the lantern while she read documents in the barn, and ridden 2 hours to Garrison and back to find something worth fighting with, and sat across from her now, in the lamplight, telling her about the thing that had broken him open years ago, and she felt something that was so much larger than she had room for, that she had to look away from it briefly, or it would show too plainly on her face. I'm sorry, she said, about Rose. I'm not, he said. More quietly, not anymore. The lamp flickered. Clara Mae stood up, before she did something she couldn't walk back from. I need to write to Price tonight. Get the letter in the Morning Post. I'll take it to town, he said. He stood as well. Don't have to. His voice stopped her. He turned. He was standing on the other side of the table with his hat in his hands, always the hat, always held like that, like a man who'd learned to give his hand something honest to do when he was saying something difficult. Need to tell you something. She waited. When I came through Millhaven 6 weeks ago, he said, I wasn't looking for work. I was just passing through. I'd been passing through a lot of places for a long time. He looked at his hat. I stopped, because I saw 5 people ride up your road that morning. And I saw you come out onto that porch, and I saw the way you stood. He looked up. Me. You stood like someone who was going to hold their ground no matter what it cost them. And I hadn't seen that in a long time. That specific kind of. He stopped. I don't have a good word for it. Stubbornness, she said. Dignity, he said. The word landed somewhere inside her that had been waiting for something to land there for a very long time. I stayed because I wanted to, he said. Not because I needed the work. I want you to know that. Clara Mae looked at him across the kitchen table. She should say something sensible. She should say something about the letter to Price, or the Morning Post, or the South Pasture fence. She should say the 20 reasonable things that existed in the space between where they were standing and where this conversation was going. Instead, she said, I know, and the way she said it quietly, without looking away, said everything else. Neither of them moved. And from outside, Pete's voice broke through the dark with the particular urgency of a 16-year-old. Who has found a problem he cannot solve, ma'am, Mrs. Sutton, something's wrong with the south fence again. Clara Mae closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them, and picked up the lamp, and said, Come on, and went out the door. The south fence had been cut again. Not one section this time. 3. In 3 different places along the 200-yard stretch nearest the creek that was, Clara Mae understood with absolute clarity as she stood there in the dark with the lantern, the very water source that Aldgate's filing covered. He was telling her something. He was telling her he could make this very difficult. Pete, she said. Danny, get rope and patch these as best you can for tonight. Light, we do it properly. She turned to Eli. We need to find out who's doing this. I have an idea, Eli said. His voice had changed. The quiet evenness was still there, but underneath it was something harder and colder. Give me tonight. She looked at him. I'm not going to do anything that brings you trouble, he said. I just want to know who's riding out here after dark. I want to see it myself, and then we have something Price can use. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight was unsteady in the night wind. Be careful. He tipped his hat. Then he walked away into the dark. Clara Mae stayed at the fence with Pete and Danny until it was patched well enough for the night, and then she poised to Beb's bed and stood alone at the south border of her land and listened to the creek moving in the dark and thought about James's handwriting in the ledger, and Eli's story about Rose and 14 months and a future that hadn't arrived in time, and the particular patience of Thomas Aldgate, and what it meant for a man like that to look at her the way he had that morning. Like a temporary condition. She was not going to be a temporary condition. She was not going to be a cautionary tale about a woman who held on too long and then let go anyway. She went back to the house and wrote the letter to Price, every detail she'd found in James's ledger, April 3rd entry, and her interpretation, her request for his next step. She sealed it and set it by the door. She was still at the table when she heard a single shot. Far off, from the south. She was out the door, before the sound had fully registered, moving fast across the yard, her heart doing something it had no business doing, calling Eli's name into the dark, before she'd made any conscious decision to call it. Silence, then boots on the hard ground moving fast toward her. Eli came out of the dark at a half-run, and he was upright and moving cleanly, which meant he wasn't hit, and she exhaled so hard she had to put one hand on the fence post to steady herself. "I'm all right," he said immediately. "What happened?" He stopped in front of her. He was breathing hard. In his hand was a piece of wire. "I caught one of Aldgate's men out by the south fence," he said. Young man, maybe 19. He panicked when I stepped out of the shadows and he fired wide and ran. He held up the wire. But he dropped this. It was a length of wire, with a distinctive cut pattern on one end, and attached to it was a small piece of leather stamping. A marker. 2 interlocking letters. She took it from him. Held it up to the moonlight. T.A. Thomas Aldgate's brand marker. "This is equipment," she said. "His ranch uses that specific gauge of wire," Eli said. "I've seen it on his fence line when I rode past. It's not common he orders it special from a supplier in Cheyenne. Bo Strickland told me that when we were on the Reardon Drive. He looked at the wire in her hands. That's not proof that'll hold in court by itself. But combined with the ledger entry and Price's argument about the water rights filing. It builds a picture," Clara Mae said. "It builds a picture," he agreed. "And pictures are what juries remember." She held the wire. Her land, her creek, her fence, cut 3 times, her husband's careful handwriting. Dottie's savings, the Reardon cattle moving across the valley with Clara Mae at the front. Eli in the dark with his hand out, holding something that mattered. She looked up at tomorrow, she said. "We go to the sheriff." Linked. "Bardney's in Aldgate's pocket, not Barden," she said. "Territorial Marshal. His circuit comes through Garrison every 3rd Thursday. Price would know how to reach him." She held up the wire. "We bring this." Eli was quiet for a moment, then the almost smiled. "Ever. You're not done fighting." "I haven't started fighting," she said. "I've been surviving. There's a difference." He looked at her. "Now I'm starting to fight," she said. He nodded once. Slowly. "Then let's go back inside," he said, "because we have a long night ahead and you still need to add a section to that letter." She turned toward the house. "Eli," she said without turning back. "Yeah, I'm glad you stopped passing through." A silence. "Nee, soft am I," he said. They went inside. The lamp burned until nearly 3 in the morning. And when Clara Mae finally put it out and went to bed, she held the wire and the ledger entry and the letter to Price in her mind, like a hand of cards she hadn't had yesterday, not a winning hand yet. Not quite, but real. Substantive. Something to play. Tomorrow Thomas Aldgate would wake up believing he was still in control of this situation. He was about to find out what it meant to underestimate a woman who had already survived everything she was supposed to break under. A wire sat on the kitchen table in the dark, and outside, somewhere along the south fence, the creek kept moving her creek, her water, her land the same as it had moved every night, since James's father had first broken this ground. She was not leaving, not 1 inch, not 1 drop. The letter to Calvin Price went out on the 7 o'clock post. N handed it to the postal rider herself, standing at the gate in the early morning with the wire piece wrapped in cloth inside her coat pocket and the ledger under her arm. And she watched the rider disappear down the road toward Garrison and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Motion, not survival, not holding on. Actual forward motion, like a wheel that had been stuck finally catching ground. She turned back to the house to find Eli on the porch with 2 cups, the same as he'd been doing every morning for 6 weeks now, and the ordinariness of it hit her somewhere unexpected the way it had become ordinary. The way she'd started expecting it without deciding to, and she took the cup and sat down beside him on the top step and didn't say anything for a minute. "Mo Strickland," she said finally. Eli looked at her. He told you about Aldgate's wire supplier." On the Reardon Drive, she turned the cup in her hands. "Would he testify to that, in front of a marshal?" Eli thought for a moment. Beau's not the kind of man who makes trouble for himself. "That's not what I asked," he said. "It's not." He was quiet. "Has a specific reason to dislike Thomas Aldgate." About 3 years ago, Aldgate's men ran Beau's brother off a leased grazing allotment using a legal technicality that Beau still believes was manufactured. Brother lost 6 months of work. He paused. So if someone asked Beau Strickland to stand up in front of a marshal and say what he knows about Aldgate's operation, Beau might decide that was worth the trouble. "I need to talk to him. I'll find him today," she nodded. Drank her coffee. The morning was already heating up, the way Wyoming mornings did in late summer fast, with a kind of impatience, as if the day had somewhere else to be. "There's something else," Eli said. His tone shifted just slightly. Enough that she turned to look at him. "Last night, before I came back with the wire, the boy who fired and ran," he looked at his cup. Recognized him. She waited. "His name is Cody Wills. He's 19, maybe 20. His father works a small claim east of Millhaven." "They're not Aldgate's regular men." Eli paused, "which means Aldgate hired him separately. Under the table. Which is the kind of thing a man does when he doesn't want a transaction to be traceable back through his regular payroll." Clara Mae set her cup down. "Cody Wills," she said. "I know his father, Warren Wills. He owes a note to Aldgate's associate at the Millhaven supply store." Eli looked at her. "So Aldgate has leverage on the father. And used the son to do work he couldn't put his name on." Her jaw tightened. "That boy could have killed you." "He wasn't trying to," Eli said. Shot was wide. He panicked. He paused. "He's not a criminal, Clara Mae. He's a scared kid doing what a powerful man told him to do, because his family is in debt." She sat with that for a moment. It would have been easier if Cody Wills were a villain. It was harder to deal with the truth, which was that Thomas Aldgate was the kind of man who turned frightened people into instruments. "Cody Wills told the marshal what he was paid to do," she said. "And who paid him?" "It breaks the case wide open," Eli said. "But getting him to talk means Aldgate can't come after his father. Which means we need to neutralize the debt first. Or convince the boy that talking is safer than staying quiet." He looked at her. "It's a conversation you'd need to have, not me." She understood what he meant. A woman who'd lost a husband, fighting to keep her land. Cody Wills might listen to that in a way he wouldn't listen to a man he didn't know. "And Beau," she said. "I'll find Cody Wills." He stood and picked up both cups and went inside without being asked to, which was the kind of thing she'd stopped noticing and then started noticing again. He set the cups in the basin. He came back to the door. "Mae," she looked up. "Be careful with the Wills boy. If Aldgate finds out you've talked to him before we have the marshal mine." "No." She met his eyes. "I'll be careful." She rode into town at mid-morning, which was calculated. Mid-morning was when Warren Wills usually came to the supply store for his weekly order, which meant Cody was often left working their claim alone. She was right. Cody Wills was splitting fence posts behind the small Wills cabin when Clara Mae rode up, and the look on his face when he recognized her was the most honest thing she'd seen in weeks. Pure, undisguised alarm. The look of a boy who had spent the night lying awake calculating exactly how badly he had miscalculated. He didn't run. She was glad of that. "Mrs. Sutton," he said. "Cody." She stopped her horse at a comfortable distance. Not threatening. "I'm not here to make trouble for you." He gripped the splitting axe like he might need it for something other than fence posts. "I don't know what you're talking about, ma'am." "You left something at my south fence last night," she said. "Of Aldgate's brand wire. I have it." She kept her voice level. "I'm not bringing it to the sheriff. Barden won't do anything useful with it anyway." His grip on the axe relaxed very slightly. She watched his face doing arithmetic. "I'm taking it to the territorial marshal," she said, "who will be in garrison on Thursday. And I have a land lawyer in garrison who will be presenting evidence about what Thomas Aldgate has been doing to my property and my water rights." "Anne," Cody swallowed. "Nah. I'm telling you this, Clara Mae said, because when the marshal starts asking questions, he's going to find you. He's good at his job, and when he finds you, you'll have a choice about what you say." She paused. "I'd rather you made that choice now, with some time to think, than in front of a federal officer, with your father standing next to you." Cody Wills looked at her for a long moment. He was younger than she'd realized, with his father's sharp jaw and the specific exhaustion of someone who'd grown up watching a family scramble against debt. She recognized it. She'd been doing her own version of it for 7 months. "He said it was just cutting fence," Cody said. His voice was very quiet. "He said it wasn't hurting anybody." "He lied to you," Clara Mae said. "He's been cutting my fence 3 times to pressure me off my land. You were the hand doing it. That makes you a participant in criminal mischief, which is a jailable offense in this territory." Went coat nil, but Clara Mae said, and let that word sit for a moment, "A man who cooperates with a federal investigation, who can testify to who hired him, what he was paid, and what he was instructed to do, that man is a witness. Not a defendant." She held his eyes. "Your father's debt to Aldgate's associate at the supply store." "How much?" Cody blinked. $83. "If I pay that debt," Clara Mae said, "your father owes Aldgate nothing. Aldgate has no leverage on your family. And you're free to tell the truth without worrying about what it costs them." Silence stretched. "You'd do that?" Cody said. "Us? I'd do it 'cause it's the right thing," she said. "And because I need a witness who was actually there." She paused. "I won't lie to you, Cody. I'm asking you to stand up against a powerful man. It's not small, I know that." He looked at the axe in his hands. "He set it against the fence post. My pa didn't know," he said, "what I was doing out there at night. I told him I was helping a friend. I know he'd be stopped." His jaw worked. "He'd be ashamed of me." "Then give him a reason not to be," Clara Mae said. Cody Wills looked at her for a long, weighing moment. "Nay." Then he nodded. She rode back to the ranch with his agreement in hand, and $83 less in the tin box that she'd replenished from the Reardon payment, and she felt the precise weight of that, exchanged the money, the risk, the frightened face, and decided it was worth every dollar. She had almost reached her gate when she saw the second horse tied to her fence post. A horse she didn't recognize. Fine animal, well kept, carrying a tooled leather saddle that cost more than her monthly food supplies. She slowed. Margaret Aldgate was sitting on her porch steps. Not Thomas, Margaret. Clara Mae came through the gate and dismounted and tied her own horse and stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Thomas Aldgate's wife, who had the look of someone who had done something that took courage and wasn't entirely sure it had been the right decision. "Mrs. Aldgate," Clara Mae said. "Mrs. Sutton." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "I've come to tell you something, and I want you to understand before I do that. Thomas doesn't know I'm here." Clara Mae climbed the steps and sat in the chair across from her. "I'm listening," she said. Margaret Aldgate looked at her gloved hands. She was a proud woman. Clara Mae had always known that, and pride was expensive currency when you were trying to say something honest. "Husband is going to file the water rights petition on Friday," Margaret said. "I found the paperwork on his desk yesterday morning. He's already arranged it with the territorial court clerk in Cheyenne. He has a contact there who will expedite the filing." "And a Friday. Why are you telling me this?" Clara Mae said. Margaret looked up, and in her face, beneath the pride and the careful social composure, was something Clara Mae hadn't expected to see. "Shame. Because I've watched him do this to 3 other families," Margaret said. "And I told myself each time that it was legal, and that people should manage their own affairs better, and that Thomas was just practical." She stopped. "And then I watched what he sent Cody Wills to do. I heard him arrange it in my own house. Her voice dropped. A boy that age. For what? For 412 acres, Clara Mae said. And a creek. Yes, Margaret pressed her lips together. I can't undo what he's done, but I can tell you it's coming. And I can tell you that in 1877, when that water rights filing was made, it's told James Sutton he was doing him a favor. He told James he was providing territorial standing at no cost. And James thanked him. She paused. I was there. I heard it. House called it a good neighbor gesture. Clara Mae went very still. You were present, she said. Yes. When Aldgate told James explicitly that there was no cost and no obligation attached to the co-signing. You would testify to that. Margaret Aldgate met her eyes. Yes, she said, for the third time, and each yes had cost more than the one before it. Eli looked at this woman who had looked at her on the boardwalk and said some women simply aren't made for this kind of life, and felt something complicated and not entirely unkind move through her. Understand what it means, Clara Mae said, if you testify against your husband. I understand it perfectly. Margaret's voice was very steady. I've had 23 years to understand what kind of man Thomas is. I've been practical about it for 23 years. She stood. I find I'm less interested in practical than I used to be. She walked down the porch steps and untied her horse and rode away without looking back. Clara Mae sat on her porch and watched her go. She was still sitting there when Eli came back with Bo Strickland riding beside him. Bo was exactly what Eli had described, a quiet, weathered man in his mid-40s, who had the compact presence of someone who'd spent his life making himself useful and had gotten very good at it. Nodded at Clara Mae. A.T. sat down when she offered, and told her plainly, in about 4 sentences, that yes, he would testify about the wire gauge and the supplier in Cheyenne, and yes, waiting for someone to give him a reason to say it out loud in front of someone who could do something with it. Then Clara Mae told them both about Margaret Aldgate. Eli was quiet for a long moment after she finished. She came here on her own, he said. Yes, without Thomas knowing. Yes. He looked at the road where Margaret's dust was still settling. That took something. It took 23 years of something, Clara Mae said. Bo Strickland said, You've got 3 witnesses and physical evidence, and a land lawyer who knows the territorial court system. What you don't have is time. He looked at her with the directness of a man who dealt in plain facts. 8 days, 2 days. I know, Clara Mae said. Can Price file something before Friday that freezes the court clerk's processing? Clara Mae and Eli looked at each other. I don't know, she said. To Garrison tonight, Eli said. Not tomorrow. Night. The road after dark, I'll ride with you. Nay. She opened her mouth to say she didn't need him to ride with her. She closed it again, because she had already learned the difference between what she needed and what was simply better, and asking someone to ride a dark road alone on 2 days' notice was not stubbornness, it was stupidity. At 6, she said. I'll be ready, Eli said. O stood and shook her hand and said he'd be in Garrison by Thursday morning, and then he rode away. And Eli went to find Pete to give instructions for the ranch, and Clara Mae went inside and sat at the kitchen table one more time. She pulled out the survey map and looked at the creek line. Her creek, the water that fed the east pasture and the south pasture and kept the land alive in summer. The thing James had filed for. The thing Aldgate had put his name on and called a favor, and then waited 11 years to use as a weapon. She folded the map carefully, put it in her coat pocket. Then she went to the strongbox and took out every document that had bearing on the case, the original water rights filing, James's ledger with the April 3rd entry, the receipts from the bank payment, the letter she'd written to Price, and put them all in the leather satchel that had been James's and that she had not used since his death, because she hadn't had occasion, and also because it still smelled like him. She carried it to the barn and tied it to her saddle. 5:30, Eli found her checking her horse's cinch. There's one more thing, he said. She looked at him. Aldgate knows we went to Garrison for Price. Bo told me in town that word had already spread that I rode out there. In Millhaven, things spread. He paused. If he figures out what we're doing before Friday morning, he might try to accelerate the filing even further. Tonight by telegraph, if his Cheyenne contact can manage it. Can he do that? It's irregular. But irregular things happen when money changes hands. Clara Mae thought for a moment. Then we need to move faster than he expects us to move. Yes, and we need someone watching his telegraph office communications. Eli was quiet. She said, he runs the telegraph office. E and James played cards together for 12 years. He came to the funeral, she thought. He's not going to hand over private messages. But if someone were to mention to Sam Greer, casually, that Thomas Aldgate might be using the telegraph to file court documents in an irregular way that could constitute fraud. Sam would be watching those messages very carefully, Eli said. And Sam would know what to do with what he saw. Eli looked at her. That expression again, the warm one, the one that had started happening more frequently, and that she had started looking for more frequently, which was its own kind of admission. You've been thinking about this for weeks, he said. Haven't you? All of it, not just the immediate step. The whole board. I've had time, she said, while I was surviving. Larry said. You were never just surviving. She secured the satchel strap and checked it twice. Go talk to Sam Greer, then come back and we ride. He went. She stood in the barn with her horse and breathed. Ed had bought that land with his father's own sweat and had borrowed against it because he believed in what they were building, and he had written in his careful, tight handwriting no debt to A. 80. Because he was a precise man who kept honest records, and he had died before he could protect what he'd built, and Clara Mae had spent 7 months keeping it alive on the strength of his memory and her own stubbornness. But what was happening now, this wasn't his memory anymore. This was hers. This was Clara Mae Sutton at 26 with a satchel of evidence, and a landlawyer in Garrison, and a witness who had 23 years of truth to tell, and a boy who'd decided being ashamed was worse than being afraid. This was her fight. She took hold of the saddle horn and mounted up. The ride to Garrison was 2 hours in the dark, and they did it in near silence, the way people who know each other well ride together, not because there's nothing to say, but because the dark and the motion make a particular kind of company that words would only interrupt. Halfway there, Eli said, tell me about James if you want to. She thought for a moment. He laughed at everything, she said. Not meanly, just everything was something he could find the funny side of. Even the bad things. She kept her eyes on the road. The summer they crop failed. He came inside and said, well, Clara Mae, I believe the drought has strong opinions about our financial plans. And then he sat down and we figured out what to do. Eli was quiet. He would have liked you, she said. He liked people who said what they meant and meant what they said. A good thing to be remembered for. Yes. A pause. He'd have had opinions about this whole situation. About Aldgate. She almost smiled. He'd have had strong opinions about the fence cutting. I imagine. She looked at the road ahead. He would have wanted me to fight for it. That's the thing I know. He would have wanted... She stopped. Yet, he would have wanted me to be happy, she said. Very quietly. That's the thing he always said. Clara Mae, I just want you to be happy. That looks like. He said it like it was simple. She was quiet for a moment. I used to think he was being naive. And now, she thought about the kitchen lamp burning at 3 in the morning. She thought about 2 cups of coffee on the porch steps every morning. She thought about the way she'd exhaled when Eli came out of the dark, upright and unhurt. Now, I think he understood something I'm still learning, she said. Eli didn't respond immediately. They rode another few minutes in the dark. Then he said, for what it's worth, I understand what he meant. Nair. She looked at him, Nen. In the moonlight, his face was serious and settled, the way it always was, no performance, no pretense, just Eli Calhoun looking at her and meaning every word. Yeah, she said, I think you do. Calvin Price opened his door at 10:15 at night without surprise, which said something about the kind of life he'd lived. He was a small, thin man in his 70s, with sharp eyes and the particular alertness of someone whose mind had never slowed down, even when his body had started making concessions. He looked at the satchel. "You found something." "We found several things," Clara Mae said. He said. "There's coffee." They sat at his kitchen table. Wade kept sitting at kitchen tables with men who were worth trusting, which was a pattern she was beginning to see as a choice she was making rather than a coincidence, and she laid out everything. Ledger entry, The Wire, Margaret Aldgate, Cody Wills. Friday filing, the Cheyenne contact. Price listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for 30 seconds. "Margaret Aldgate," he said. "You're sure?" "She sat on my porch and said it 3 times, Clara Mae said. Looked at Eli. "You believe her?" "I believe she's made a decision she can't unmake," Eli said. "I believe she knows what it costs." Price nodded slowly. "All right." He pulled a stack of papers toward him. "Here's what we're going to do. Tonight, I'm going to prepare a filing for the Territorial Court in Cheyenne that preempts Aldgate's water rights petition by challenging the original joint filing on grounds of nominal consideration, which is what James's ledger entry supports. I'll attach an affidavit from you, Clara Mae N., sworn tonight, attesting to the ledger entry and the contents. If I send it by telegraph first thing tomorrow morning, we can get it into the clerk's hands before Aldgate's filing goes through." His Cheyenne contact, Clara Mae said. "Can he block yours?" "He can try," Price said, "but I know the chief clerk personally, and I know that man's sense of professional integrity. If Aldgate's contact tries to rush through a filing that conflicts with one already in process, he'll have questions to answer." He paused. "And if there's a federal marshal involved, the questions become considerably more serious." "About the marshal," Eli said. "He's in garrison Thursday," Price said. "I'll have everything ready for him." He looked at Clara Mae. "Mrs. Sutton, I need you to write out a complete sworn statement tonight. Every detail. The fence cutting, the wire, the Wills boy, the bank acceleration, everything. Don't leave anything out. How long do I have?" "About 3 hours," Price said. "I need to sleep at least 2 before I'm any use for the legal work." Clara Mae took the pen he offered. She wrote for 2.5 hours straight. Eli sat across from her and drank coffee, and when she paused to remember a detail, talked her through the chronology the way he'd been doing, for 7 weeks quietly, usefully, without taking over. At 1 in the morning she set down the pen, 23 pages. Read them in 40 minutes. He marked 4 places where she needed to add specifics. She read them again. "This is good," he said. "This is very be enough," she said. He looked at her over his reading spectacles. "Mrs. Sutton, in 35 years of land law, I have seen more cases decided on less than what you've brought me tonight." He set the papers down. "The question isn't whether the evidence is sufficient. The question is whether the people who need to act on it will do their jobs. And if they don't, then we make noise until they do." He looked at her steadily. "But my experience is that a woman who rides to garrison at night with a satchel full of evidence and writes 23 pages in 2.5 hours is exactly the kind of person who knows how to make noise." He almost laughed. It came out as something close enough. She looked at Eli. He was watching her with that expression, warm, steady, wholly focused on her, and she thought about what James had said and what she was still learning. And what it meant that she was sitting in a stranger's kitchen in the middle of the night feeling, underneath all the fear and the exhaustion and the stakes, something that was uncomplicatedly alive. "Be right back at first light," she said. "I'll wake you," Eli said. He slept 3 hours on Calvin Price's settee and dreamed about the creek. When she woke, Eli was already at the window, watching the sky lighten, his hat on, his posture saying the day had already begun, whether the rest of the world was ready or not. "Mess's telegraph goes out in 40 minutes, he said. The filing will be in the clerk's hands in Cheyenne before 9. She sat up, smoothed her dress, put her boots on. "And Aldgate?" Amgrier sent word last night, Eli said. Aldgate sent a telegraph to Cheyenne at 10 o'clock. His contact replied that he'd process the water rights petition first thing Friday morning. Clara Mae stood up, which means Price's filing gets there first. Several hours, Eli said. She exhaled. We're not done, she said. We still need the marshal. We still need Bo. We still need Margaret and Cody Wills to hold. I know, he said. But we're ahead for the first time. He looked at her directly. That matters. She picked up the empty satchel lighter now, everything left in Price's hands, and looked at Eli Calhoun in the growing morning light. Let's go home, she said. He held the door. They rode back to Millhaven in the early morning, and, when the Sutton Ranch came into view at the end of the road, the house, the barn, the south fence Pete had repaired, the creek line just visible beyond the east pasture. Clara Mae felt something settle in her chest with the weight and finality of something that had been decided. This was hers. Everything she had done in 7 months and 6 weeks, and one very long night, had been for this exact view from this exact road. She rode through her gate. Pete was already working the south pasture. Danny was at the barn. The cattle were in the right places. The ranch looked like itself, worn, practical, alive. She dismounted and tied her horse and stood in the yard and looked at all of it. Eli came to stand beside her. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he said. 2 days. 2 days to hold everything together, while Price's filing moved through the territorial system, and Aldgate figured out that the ground had shifted under him. 2 days, and then a federal marshal, and then for the first time, something resembling justice. She turned toward the house. Eli, she said, yeah. She stopped. She turned around. He was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, always that hat, always that honest gesture, and she looked at him and made a decision that wasn't really a decision at all, because decisions implied choosing between options. And this had stopped feeling like something she was choosing and started feeling like something she was finally allowing. When this is over, she said. When the marshal comes and Price finishes and Aldgate is done with my water and my fence. He said quietly. I'd like to have dinner, she said. Not because we're tired and it's convenient. A real dinner. Like two people who have something to say to each other that isn't about the ranch. Almost smile became something else. Something full and certain and entirely without performance. I'd like that, he said. Very much, she nodded once. Then she went inside to start the day. Behind her, she heard him put his hat back on. And for the first time in 7 months, 2 weeks, and 43 days, she walked through her own front door, feeling something she recognized, clearly and without confusion, as joy. Thursday came in fast and cold. Clara Mae was up before 4, which had stopped being unusual somewhere around the 3rd week of everything falling apart and had simply become the rhythm her body kept now. She dressed in the dark, made coffees, sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her, even though there was nothing new to calculate. It was habit, something to do with her hands while her mind ran through everything that had to hold today. Price's filing was in Cheyenne. She'd received his confirmation by telegraph Wednesday afternoon, filed, received, logged, assigned a case number. That case number was the thing that mattered. It meant Aldgate's Friday filing, whenever it arrived, would walk into a clerk's office that already had a competing claim on record. The marshal's name was Cade Whitmore. He was 51 years old, had served the territorial circuit for 19 years, and Calvin Price had described him in a one-line telegraph as a man who does not appreciate having his time wasted and has never once wasted anyone else's. Which Clara Mae took as the best possible endorsement. He was due in Garrison by noon. She and Eli were riding out at 8 to meet him there, with the satchel rebuilt, the wire, the ledger, as of every document Price had prepared, Bo Strickland's written statement, which had arrived by rider Wednesday evening, and Cody Wills's signed account of what he'd been paid and by whom, which Cody had delivered himself on foot. Clara Mae's gate on Wednesday morning, with his hat in his hands and his jaw set in the particular way of a young man who has decided to stop being afraid. She had shaken his hand. she had paid Warren Wills's debt to Aldgate's associate at the supply store that same afternoon. It was the right thing. That was all. She didn't expect anything for it, and she hadn't done it to purchase loyalty. She'd done it because a frightened family was being used as a tool by a powerful man, and that was not something she could leave in place once she'd seen it. Eli had said, when she told him, James would have done the same thing. She'd said, I know, but I'm not doing it because James would have. I'm doing it because I would. He'd looked at her with that expression for a long moment. Then he'd said, yeah, I know. She heard his boots on the porch at 5:30, and then the door, and then the coffee pot, in that exact order, the way it had been every morning for nearly 2 months. And she thought about how quickly a person could become essential without you ever deciding to let them. He set her cup in front of her and sat down across the table. He said, nervous, she said. He nodded. No performance of reassurance, just acknowledgement. Me too, he said. That surprised her enough that she looked up. You're nervous, she said. I've been nervous since Monday, he said. I just don't see the point in announcing it. He wrapped his hands around his cup. A lot that has to go right today. It will. Probably, he looked at her. It will, she said more firmly. Not because she was certain, because she had decided to be, and she had learned that there was a difference between certainty that arrived on its own and certainty that you put on like a coat, because the alternative was standing in the cold. Held her gaze. Yes, ma'am, he said. They rode out at 8. Amy. The morning was sharp and still the kind of late summer morning in Wyoming that reminded you winter was forming its opinion just over the mountains, not arrived yet but thinking seriously about it. Clara rode with the satchel horn and her spine straight and her eyes on the road, and she thought about nothing except the next thing, and the next thing and the next thing after that. Hour in, Eli said, tell me how you want to handle Whitmore. Directly, she said. No softening. He's a man who doesn't like time wasted, so I don't waste it. I tell him what Aldgate has done, in order, with the evidence for each piece. At the document speak, she paused. I don't ask him to feel sorry for me. Ask him to look at what's in front of him. Good, Eli said. You think so? I think you've been rehearsing since Monday, and that's the version that came out clean. He wrote a beat. Don't over-explain the water rights. Price's filing does that work. Just tell Whitmore what the wire is and where it came from, and let Bo and Cody's accounts fill in the criminal side. You've been thinking about this too. Couldn't sleep much either, he said. She looked at him sideways. This man, this infuriatingly steady, quietly brilliant man, who had ridden in off the road 9 weeks ago and stayed, and worked, and made 2 cups of coffee every morning, and ridden 2 hours in the dark to Garrison, and caught a frightened boy in the act, and brought back the evidence, instead of the confrontation, and sat across from her at kitchen tables, while she wrote 23 pages, and never once suggested she was doing it wrong. Looked back at the road. After today, she said. Yeah, he said. He knew what she meant. The dinner I mentioned. I remember. I was thinking Saturday, she said. Every Saturday, he said. Whatever happens today. That was right. Whatever happens today. Not contingent on winning. Not a reward for a good outcome. Just Saturday. Because that was the day, and they were the people. It was time. Calvin Price was waiting at his office, with the territorial marshal when they arrived in Garrison at 10:10. Whitmore was not what she'd expected, which was probably intentional on the marshal's part. He was a medium-sized man, not imposing at first look, with a brown beard going gray and a quiet, watchful face that gave nothing away. He wore his bag the way people wore things that stopped noticing present, not displayed. His eyes moved over Clara Mae when Price introduced her, and then they moved over Eli, and then they came back to Clara Mae and stayed. Mrs. Sutton, he said, I've read Price's summary. I'd like to hear it from you directly. She had prepared for this. She sat across from him at Price's office table, with the satchel open in front of her, and she told him everything. She told it in order, without emotion in her voice, not because she didn't feel it, but because this was not the place for it. This was the place for facts. She told him about the bank notice and the 30 days, and Harlan Briggs and Thomas Aldgate arriving together that morning on her porch with a legal representative whose services she believed Aldgate had arranged. She told him about the fence cutting 3 times and the wire with the brand marker. She told him about the water rights filing from 1877 and James's ledger entry from April 3rd of that year. She told him about Calvin Price and the preemptive filing. She told him about Margaret Aldgate coming to her porch. When she got to Margaret Aldgate, Whitmore held up one hand. "Thomas Aldgate's wife," he said. "She came to you voluntarily." On Tuesday afternoon, Clara Mae said, "She sat on my porch steps and told me Thomas planned to file the water rights petition on Friday. She said she had been 1877 when Thomas told my husband explicitly that the co-signing arrangement carried no cost and no obligation." She paused. She said she was tired of watching him do this to people. Whitmore looked at Price. Price spread his hands in a gesture that said, "I told you." Whitmore looked back at Clara Mae and Cody Wills. 19 years old. His father has a debt to an Aldgate associate at the Millhaven supply store. Aldgate used that leverage to put the boy out on my property at night with wire cutters. She set Cody's signed account on the table. He's written out everything he was paid, what he was instructed to do, and how many times. Whitmore picked up the document. He read it. His face gave nothing away. "The wire," Clara Mae said. She placed it on the table beside Cody's account, still wrapped in its cloth. "This is the piece he dropped when he ran. Such as the gauge and cut pattern that Bo Strickland worked on Aldgate's property can identify as specific to Aldgate's supplier in Cheyenne." She placed Bo's written statement beside it. Then she placed James's ledger, open to the April 3rd entry, in front of Whitmore. The entry. He read it again. He looked up. "No debt to A," he said. "In my husband's handwriting," Clara Mae said. April 3, 1877, 3 weeks after the water rights filing. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Sutton," he said finally. "In 19 years, I have sat across from a lot of people who believed they had a case." He looked at the documents arranged in front of him. "You have a case." Something in Clara Mae's chest unlocked with a click she could almost hear. "What happens now?" she said. "I ride to Millhaven this afternoon," Whitmore said. "I speak with Thomas Aldgate directly. I inform him that his water rights petition will be contested on grounds that are now on record in the territorial court system, and that any further interference with your property, any fence cutting, any pressure on witnesses, any attempt to accelerate court filings through improper channels will result in federal charges." He paused. "I'll also be having a conversation with Harlan Briggs about the circumstances of the banknote acceleration. That may or may not go further depending on what Briggs says." "Margaret Aldgate?" Clara Mae said. "I'll need to speak with her," Whitmore said. "If possible." Her testimony about the 1877 conversation changes the character of the joint filing significantly. He paused. "Is she prepared that conversation?" "I believe she is," Clara Mae said. "She knew what she was starting when she came to my porch." Whitmore nodded. He began gathering the documents to copy them. Price had a copying press, and then he stopped and looked at Clara Mae across the table. "One more thing," he said. "In my experience, when a man like Aldgate understands that a case is moving against him, he has 2 choices. He can accept the situation and withdraw, or he can escalate." He held her gaze. "I want you prepared for either." "I've been prepared for escalation since the first fence was cut," Clara Mae said. Whitmore looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I can see that." He stood and shook her hand. Then he looked at Eli. "Calhoun, Price told me what you've done here. The ride to Garrison, the evidence recovery." He paused. "That took judgment. Mrs. Sutton made the decisions," Eli said. "I just held the lantern." Whitmore's expression changed very slightly. "Right," he said. He went with Price to copy the documents. Clara Mae sat at the empty table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Eli came to stand behind her chair, not touching her. Just there. You did it, he said quietly. We're not done, she said. No, he said, but you did it. She looked at the empty table where the documents had been. 23 pages written at 1 in the morning. A piece of wire. A boy's scared handwriting. A proud woman sitting on her porch steps. An old man's ledger entry that had waited 11 years to matter. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She did it. The ride back to Millhaven was different from every other ride she'd made in the last 9 weeks. She couldn't name what was different exactly. The road was the same. Sky was the same blue. Her horse moved the same way. But something in the quality of the air between her and Eli had changed, or maybe it had been changing for weeks. And this was the first morning she'd been still enough to feel it clearly. They were an hour from home when she said, "Tell me something I don't know about you." He looked at her. "What do you want to know?" "Anything," she said. "Real, not the job history." He thought for a moment. "I wanted to be a school teacher," he said. She turned to look at him. "When I was about 14, he said. My mother's second cousin had a teaching post in a small town in Kentucky. I used to watch him and think that's the most useful thing a person can do. Put something in someone's head that was never there before." He paused. Then my father's ranch went under when I was 16, and I needed to work, and the work that was available was cattle, and I was good at it, so." "You could still teach," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I'm 40 years old." And he was quiet for a moment. "What did you want to be?" he said. She thought about it. "I wanted to have this ranch," she said. "I know that sound." "It doesn't sound like anything except true," he said. "When I was small, my father used to bring me here to visit James's father, old Mr. Sutton, and I used to walk the east pasture with him, and he'd tell me what he was growing and why and how the soil worked. And I thought, this is it. This is the thing." She looked at the road ahead. "I knew I was going to marry James when I was 12 years old. Not because of James specifically, because of this land." "And then you fell in love with James too," Eli said. "Yes." She paused. "He knew, by the way. I told him, year 2 of the marriage." He laughed for about 10 minutes. Eli made a sound that was a genuine laugh, low and warm, and it landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. He laughed easily, she said. "You don't," she said. "But when you do, it's real." He looked at her. She looked back. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. They rode the last hour home in a silence that was the best kind, the kind that didn't need filling, because it was already full. Thomas Aldgate came to her gate at 4 o'clock that afternoon. He came alone. Clara Mae saw him from the kitchen window and took one breath and walked out to the porch, and she stood at the top of the steps with her arms at her sides and waited. Yeah, he looked different from every other time she'd seen him. The comfortable proprietary ease was gone. He was still a large, imposing man that wasn't something that changed with circumstances, but the ease was gone, and what replaced it was something more unsettled. Me? A man who had just had a conversation with a federal marshal and was still calibrating what it meant. He stopped his horse at the gate. He didn't come through it. "Mrs. Sutton," he said. "Mr. Aldgate." The kind that had weight. "The marshal came to see me," he said. "I expected he would." He was Aldgate stopped, started again. He was thorough. "Marshal Whitmore has a reputation for that," Clara Mae said. Aldgate looked at her. He really looked at her, possibly for the first time, not the assessing, proprietary look she'd been receiving from him for months, but something more direct. The look of a man seeing something he'd underestimated and being honest with himself about it. "Wife spoke to you," he said. "On Tuesday." He was quiet for a long moment. He stopped again. His jaw moved. "Margaret made her own decision, I understand that." "She did," Clara Mae said. "She's a woman who knows her own mind." Something moved across his face. It was complicated, and she didn't try to read all of it, because some of it was private in a way she had no interest in intruding on. "Water rights petition," he said. "I'm withdrawing it." Clara Mae kept her face very still. I'll file the withdrawal with the territorial court by Friday morning, he said, before my original petition would have processed. Price will receive confirmation. He paused. The joint filing from 1877 will be dissolved. The water rights on the East Creek will revert to sole holding under the Sutton property name, she said. Not triumphant. Genuine. He looked at his horse's neck for a moment. Because the marshal was very clear about what federal charges look like for a man in my position, he said. And because he stopped, because Margaret asked me to. In those words, I'm asking you, Thomas. She hasn't asked me for something in a long time. Complexity of that sat in the air between them. And the fence-cutting Clara Mae said, the Wills boy. I'll make it right with Warren Wills, Aldgate said. And with the boy. He said it with the flatness of a man accepting a consequence he'd earned. Clara Mae looked at him for a long, careful moment. She was not going to forgive Thomas Aldgate today. That was not what this moment was. He had spent months trying to take everything she had used a frightened boy as an instrument, had gone to the bank and tried to accelerate a legal process to squeeze her out, and had built a years-long plan on the assumption that a woman like her, a woman alone, a woman overweight, a woman whose worth people kept deciding for her without asking, would eventually just give up. She was not going to forgive him today, but she was going to let this moment be what it was, a man withdrawing from a fight he'd already lost without adding to it. Good day, Mr. Aldgate, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he tipped his hat and rode away. Clara Mae stood on her porch and watched him go all the way to the end of the road, and when he was gone she turned around and found Eli, standing in the barn doorway 20 feet away, arms crossed, the N leaning against the frame, the N watching her. He raised his eyebrows, a question. He's withdrawing the petition, she said. Eli was still for a beat. Then he crossed the yard in about 8 steps and stopped in front of her at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her with an expression that was the fullest she'd ever seen on his face, relief and warmth and something fierce and certain underneath both. Done, he said. The withdrawal still has to file, she said. And Price needs to confirm, Clara Mae. She stopped. It's done, he said. She looked at him. She let herself look at him for one long, unguarded moment, really look. Without the ranch and the debt and the threat, and the next step filling the space between her and everything else, and she felt the full weight of what the last 9 weeks had been, and what they had cost, and what they had built, and who had been standing beside her through all of it. She said, it is. He reached up and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration, just his hand around hers, and warm, the way he did everything present, deliberate. Entirely real. She looked at their hands. Then she looked at him. Day's still on, she said. He smiled, not the almost smile. Full one, which she had been seeing more of lately and had decided was the best thing she'd ever had occasion to catalog. Yes, ma'am, Sonny said. Saturday arrived clear and warm, one of those perfect late summer days Wyoming produced occasionally as if to apologize for the winters. Clara Mae wore her blue dress, not the old one, the one covered with dust and regret from the morning Harlan Briggs had ridden up her road. The good blue dress, the one she'd made 2 winters ago and worn twice, because there hadn't been occasion. New, she braided her hair and left 2 pieces loose at her face, the way she'd worn it when she was younger and had stopped wearing it because no one was there to see. Nay, she was looking at herself in the mirror above the wash basin. Something she did not often do, because in the morning were a fast road to thoughts she didn't have time for when she stopped and really looked. 26 years old, hair the color of good earth. Eyes that were tired in a way that wasn't entirely bad, the way tired sometimes looked on a person who'd been tired for real reasons. Hands that were rough from 9 weeks of real work. A body that was hers, round and broad and strong, and hers that had ridden cattle drives and patched fences in the dark, and sat at kitchen tables at 1 in the morning and carried everything that needed carrying. She looked at herself and said, it out loud, no one, you held on. Then she went outside. Eli was at the gate. He'd done something different with himself, too. Clara Mae noticed it immediately, the way you notice when something familiar presents itself from a new angle. He'd shaved cleanly, which made him look younger by about 5 years. He was wearing a dark shirt she hadn't seen before, which meant he'd thought about it, which meant this mattered to him in a way that made something in her chest do something warm and complicated. He had a small bunch of wildflowers in his hand. He looked at them, then at her, with the expression of a man who has done something and is not entirely certain it was the correct thing. They were by the creek road, he said. I wasn't, he paused. I wasn't sure if it was, she said. Yeah. Give me the flowers. He gave her the flowers. She smelled them, which was something she hadn't done with flowers since she couldn't remember when, and she felt something loosen in her that had been tight for so long she'd stopped knowing it was tight. Thank you, she said. He let out a breath. I wasn't sure about the flowers. Yeah, they're perfect, she said. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, which was where their whole story had happened. Really, and it seemed right to stay there. And Eli had ridden to the hotel in town and arranged with the cook to send out a proper meal, which arrived at 5 o'clock in 2 covered dishes carried by a slightly bewildered hotel boy who looked at the situation and wisely said nothing. They ate and they talked. Not about the ranch, not about the banker, the marshal, or Thomas Aldgate, or the water rights, or any of it. They talked about everything else, about Kentucky and Wyoming and the specific difficulty of cattle in cold weather, and the books they'd each read, and the foods they'd never eaten, and the places they'd been, and the places they hadn't. She told him about the summer. She was 14 and had convinced her father to let her help with the haying, and had worked alongside the men, and had come in at the end of the day, and eaten 3 helpings of supper, and her father had looked at her with such plain pride that she'd never forgotten it. He told her about a town in Colorado where the mountains were so close you could see individual trees on the peaks, and how he'd woken up there one morning and understood for the first time what it meant to be small in the world in a way that felt good rather than diminishing. She told him about James, the real James, not the memory she kept for difficult mornings, but the full one, the complicated one. The laughing, impractical, tub-ran, brilliant stubber who had borrowed slack Annie loved because he believed too hard in good outcomes and had left her holding everything he'd built. Eli listened to all of it. Then he said, he would have liked watching you fight for this. He would have had opinions, she said. Loud ones, probably. Extremely loud, she said, and laughed. A real laugh from somewhere deep and real, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. Eli was watching her laugh with that full expression on his face. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Only that I've been waiting to hear that since the day I came to your gate. She looked at him across the table, all those kitchen tables. All those 2 cups of coffee, all those moments of holding the lantern while she read something that mattered, of saying the true thing simply and then waiting, of riding beside her in the dark without asking anything she wasn't ready to give. Eli, she said, yeah, I'm going to say something and I need you to not make it into a smaller thing than it is. Put down his fork. He looked at her directly. All right. I was not looking for you, she said. I was not looking for any of this. When you came to my gate, I was trying to survive a very specific situation, and I had decided, before you arrived and for a while after you arrived, that surviving was all I was doing. She held his gaze. Yeah. And somewhere between the Reardon Drive and the Garrison Road, and 23 pages written at 1 in the morning, I realized I wasn't only surviving anymore. And that you were part of why. His expression didn't change. It deepened. I'm not a simple situation, she said. I have a ranch and a debt history and 2 teenage hands and a legal file with a federal marshal and opinions about hay cutting that most people find excessive. No, he said. And I've been a widow for 8 months, and I still talk to James sometimes when I'm at the East, because the East Fence was his favorite place to think. I know that too, he said, and She stopped. She looked at the table for a brief moment. She looked back up. I'm exactly the woman you see, not smaller than she looks to this town. Not waiting to become something more manageable. This is who I am. He was quiet for a full still beat. Then he said, "Clara Mae Sutton, the least manageable person I have ever met in my life." He said it with something that was not the almost smile and not the full smile, but something in between that was entirely its own thing, warm and certain, and completely without reservation. "And I came through your gate 9 weeks ago, and I have not wanted to be anywhere else since." She looked at him. "That is the truth," he said, "the whole of it." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held it. They sat like that for a long time in the kitchen where she'd written 23 pages, where he'd poured 2 cups of coffee every morning, where the lamp had burned until 3 in the morning and the ledgers had been counted and recounted and the decisions had been made, and the evening came in through the windows, and the ranch was quiet, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that needed to begin was beginning. 3 weeks later, Calvin Price sent a formal notice confirming that the water rights on the East Creek of the Sutton property were recorded as sole holding of Clara Mae Sutton, with all competing claims dissolved, and the record cleared. 80. She read the notice at the kitchen table. Then she walked out to the east fence, James's favorite place to think, and she stood there for a while and listened to the creek and felt the land under her boots and said what she needed to say to the man. And loved it and left it to her. Then she walked back. Eli was waiting at the barn. "It's official," she said. He nodded. "I know. Price sent me one too." He held it up, his own copy, which had apparently thought to include, which meant Price had been paying attention to more than the legal case. She looked at the notice in his hand, then at him. "You're going to stay," she said. "Not a question. If you'll have me," he said. She held gaze. "I'll have you," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "You stop calling me ma'am." The full smile. And warm and real in hers. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "N." She laughed. She walked across the yard and put her arms around him, right there in the open air where anyone riding past could see, because she was done adjusting herself to fit what Millhaven thought was appropriate for a woman like her. Nay, he held on. The land stretched around them in every direction, 412 acres. Hers, the creek running along the east border, the south pasture greening up from the late summer rains, a barn with its new shingles, the house that still smelled like James in the corners, and like coffee and leather, and something new that didn't have a name yet, but was starting to. And Clara Mae Sutton, widow rancher. Plus-size woman, who the town of Millhaven had decided was too much of most things and not enough of all the others, stood on her own ground with her arms around a man who had come through her gate 9 weeks ago and decided she was worth staying for. And she understood, clearly, and finally, what James had meant when he'd said he just wanted her to be happy. It wasn't naive. It was the most practical thing anyone had ever said to her. Because happiness, real happiness, the kind built on ground you'd fought for, and people who'd started with 2 cups of coffee, and a man who held the lantern without needing to hold anything over you, that kind of happiness was not a small or simple thing. It was exactly the kind of thing worth building a life around. She was home. She had always been home, and now for the first time in a very long time home felt the full size of what it actually was.